Shabbat shalom, everyone. This week's Torah reading, Parashat Va'era, contains amazing scenes of action, movement, and journeying, or beginning at least of a journey of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of leaving Egyptian slavery and entering a stage of freedom, stage of redemption. Near the beginning of the Torah reading, though, there's a really strange verse that speaks to the transition that Israel must undergo from being a nation of slaves to being a nation of free people. I want to share with you three ideas that I learned from Rabbi Danny Nevins, the rabbinical school at the Jewish Theological Seminary. These three ideas help us understand this transition that Israel must undergo from being slaves to being free people. Rabbi Nevins asks the question that the commentators ask about this verse. After Moses and Aaron go to the people of Israel, they try to get them to leave, and the people of Israel want nothing to do with that. They don't agree to leave. God then commands Moses again to go. And God says the following, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe ve'el Aharon. So the Lord spoke to both Moses and Aaron, commanding both the children of Israel and Pharaoh, king of the Egyptians, to free Bnei Israel from the land of Egypt. It sort of sounds like God is saying, you need to command Pharaoh to free Israel, and you need to command Israel to free Israel from slavery. So what does that mean? Isn't Israel justified in being passive here? Isn't Israel justified in just waiting for Pharaoh to let them go, for God to put the plagues on the Egyptians, for Moses to bring them out? What does the people of Israel sitting in slavery, what do they have to do in order to free themselves? The first explanation comes from the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud says, well, what did Moses have to command Israel at that point? Moses had to command Israel at that point the rules and the commands and regulations about Israelite slaves that they would get later on in the Torah, later on in Parashat Mishpatim, later on in the book of Exodus, because these rules help them understand how slavery is not a good idea. Now, that would seem odd for people who are slaves. Of course, if anyone will know that slavery is bad, it's people who are slaves. And yet, perhaps the Talmud is really on something here. The Talmud might be saying that it could be that the Israelites will fall victim to something, a pattern that many people fall victim to. This thing that we're talking about, this idea, this event, it's very bad when it happens to me and people like me. But when it happens to you or people like you, it's just not that big a deal. Maybe the Talmud is teaching us here that Israel needs to be different, that the people of Israel need to understand that slavery is bad, not Israelite slavery. Slavery is bad. It would have been nice if slavery had been outlawed, but that's not what the Torah did. But the Talmud here is giving us a way out. The Talmud here is teaching us a beautiful way to understand how Israel needed to see itself as part of a larger human family before it could leave Egyptian slavery. That's explanation number one. Explanation number two comes from the Midrash, from a collection of Midrashim called the Mechilta, which brings us back a few verses. It says, look at how Israel responded when Moses approached them and asked them about Egyptian slavery and about leaving slavery. What did Israel do? Let's look at the verse. Moses told this to the Israelites, this meaning that God with Moses would free them from slavery. They would not listen to Moses, their spirits crushed by cruel bondage. Velo shamu el Moshe mikotzer ruach ume avodah kasha. So the Mechilta, this collection of Midrashim, asks, so what does it mean that their spirits were crushed by cruel bondage? The Midrash says, well, maybe it means that they didn't want to leave slavery because that would mean giving up their Egyptian idols. Now, this may be a statement about polytheism, about idols. I think it's actually a statement about a slave mentality. Taking the Israelites physically out of Egyptian slavery was only step one. Step two, or perhaps it's the stage that has to happen before physical freedom, you have to feel free in your mind. You have to leave the world of being a slave and understand you are worthy of being a free person, that you can think as a free person. The Mechilta here is telling us that Israel wasn't there yet. Israel wasn't there, and they wouldn't get there for a long time. Maybe that's what the 40 years in the desert were really all about. The third and final explanation I'm going to bring comes from a different collection of Midrashim from the Tanhuma. The question, of course, is the same. What was Israel commanded at this point? And the answer, they were commanded to treat Pharaoh with respect. How incredible and shocking. The person who is in charge of their slavery, they are supposed to treat with respect. Perhaps this is another lesson for a people who are slaves and who are trying to be free, who yearn to be free. They need to remember that every human being is made in the image of God, not only their people, not only the people they like, but every human being, Jew and non-Jew alike. To believe and to understand that even the Egyptians need to be treated with respect, even Pharaoh needs to be treated with respect, is to give yourself the self-respect that a free person has, is to understand you have the strength and the dignity and the ability to treat others with respect, even if they did not do the same to you. To understand what Moses might have been telling Israel at this point, what he might have been telling the Israelites, the work that they had to do before they were ready to leave Egyptian slavery, is to understand the work that all of us have to do as we journey from where we are in life to where we hope. Shabbat Shalom.